Welcome to the Art and Craft of Policy Briefs, translating science and engaging stakeholders. As I record this lecture, I'm sitting in the midst of a large academic institution where every day faculty and students carry out research that's destined to be published in scientific journals. But let's consider this quote. Research is essentially unfinished unless the findings are synthesized and applied in practice to improve the situation. Almost by definition, public health research is aimed at changing the way we understand and address a problem and ultimately improving population health. So it turns out that publishing research findings doesn't always lead to their use in practice. Synthesizing findings so that they can be applied in practice requires the ability to communicate in the right way to the right people. So the goal of this lecture is to introduce some communication skills that will help you translate research, whether it's your own or other scientists, into practice for different audiences. The emphasis here is on communication, which is not the same as information. If providing information was all it took to communicate effectively, far fewer people would smoke and political discourse might sound a bit different. Academic writing is often geared primarily to sharing information. Many of the communication skills that we need to write an effective policy brief are not used commonly in writing scholarly papers, but they're all skills that can be applied in academic writing as well. Before we go on, I'd like to say a few words about what I mean by policy brief. If you search on the internet, you'll find lots of different types of documents called policy briefs. Sometimes the terms used to refer to a lengthy report with detailed analysis, like a white paper or policy briefing report. In other words, sometimes a brief isn't really so brief. For our purposes and in general use, policy brief refers to a succinct presentation of a problem, its context, and options or recommendations for applying this knowledge to policies and programs. It should be 2 to 4 pages long and understandable without additional reading or specialized knowledge, unless that specialized knowledge can be assumed for the particular audience you're writing for. Regardless of how the term is used, the goal is always to prompt change. Almost any type of public health problem lends itself to a policy brief. You might be describing a gap between health status and health objectives, or addressing a lack of consensus about solutions to a clearly defined problem, or maybe you're calling attention to a new problem or new scientific knowledge. This is an example of a policy brief that was published by the National Poverty Center. So the problem described in this brief is that focusing solely on medical care and spending is not sufficient to improve health. The brief makes a case for the influence of social and economic policy on health. Here's another example. This policy brief is from the Women's and Children's Health Policy Center, and it deals with the ramifications of our growing knowledge about environmental toxins for the practice of maternal and child health. The purpose of this brief from the West Virginia Rural Health Research Center is very clear from the title. It obviously identifies environmental health competencies for rural providers. This policy brief is titled simply School Mental Health Services. It's actually not clear from the cover or the title what the problem is, unless we are to assume that the elderly folks on the bottom of the page maybe are still in school, or perhaps they're not as happy as they look. Which leads us to the question, why should I read this? We're going to come back to this report as an example later. For now, let's get back to what a policy brief is. As I mentioned earlier, ultimately all policy briefs promote some kind of change. That might be a change in law, administrative policies or regulations, agency funding priorities, organizational practices, or program implementation. In writing a policy brief, you need to be clear about what the problem is, what kind of change might be considered, and most importantly, who the audience is. So it's always important at the outset of writing a policy brief to consider what you know about the audience. What is their technical knowledge or background? Are they data-oriented? What kinds of political or organizational culture or constraints are they working in? Have they been exposed to the issue before? Are they likely to be open to the message? Or are they maybe a little resistant to change? So answering these kinds of questions will help you identify the best hook. by which I mean the message that is likely to be the most motivating and engaging for your audience. Knowing your audience also will help you determine what kind of background information they need in order to follow your argument. Getting the background information just right is very important in such a short document. Too much of the wrong information can clutter your argument, break the flow, and distract the reader. Too little of the right information weakens your argument and conclusions. To get it just right, you'll need to use the information that your audience needs and will find compelling and engaging. So leave out information that is not directly relevant and necessary. Of course, I'm not suggesting that you leave out important information just because it maybe conflicts with the point you're trying to make. That information would probably be both relevant and necessary. I'm simply pointing out that not everything you may feel compelled to write is actually necessary for your argument. And with only 2 to 4 pages to work with, and maybe even a reader who's hoping to just skim the brief, you will want to be as succinct as possible. The goal is not to provide an exhaustive literature review, but to communicate the essential information that drives a set of recommendations. Let's talk now about the main elements of a policy brief: the aim, the description of the problem, the recommendations, and the title. You should be able to state the aim of your policy brief in just 1 or 2 sentences, and in fact you should write the aim first because everything that follows flows from that aim. Next, describe the problem. Most importantly, why it is an important issue for the audience. Use data to convey the extent of the problem. And if there aren't sufficient data, perhaps the capacity to collect it is part of the problem. You might want to describe what solutions already have been tried and how effective existing policies and programs have been. And finally, what are some options for change? You may want to lay out some policy options with pros and cons. And don't forget the option of not changing. The end point for a policy brief is a set of recommendations that are backed by evidence and flow logically from your argument. The reader should understand what actions you recommend and what effects can be anticipated. Keep in mind that concrete ideas are easier to remember than abstract ones. Abstract recommendations may also be open to different interpretations, and sometimes we fall back on abstract ideas and phrases when we don't really know what we mean ourselves. So when you're writing your recommendations, ask yourself if the reader will understand what you propose that they do. On the other hand, the more specific the recommendations you make, the more care you have to take to vet them with members of the intended audience. Take the time to get feedback and ideas from relevant stakeholders. You'll find that the time is well spent. Let's look at a few examples. What if I wrote, "Promote healthier nutrition in schools"? This could mean anything from including a unit on nutrition in every health class to banning pizza parties in schools. It's open to interpretation, and depending on who the audience is, this recommendation might or might not say anything new or noteworthy. A more specific recommendation might be to provide healthier food choices in school lunches. And even more specific, I could recommend moving fresh vegetables and lower fat foods closer to the front of the lunch line, removing sodas from school vending machines. Those are certainly clearer about what specific actions I'm promoting. Whether or not that's actually better depends on the aim of the brief, the evidence I've presented, and the intended audience. Here's an example of recommendations taken from that School Mental Health Services policy brief that we looked at earlier. Go ahead and read through them for a moment. Can you tell what actions are being recommended here? And if you read just this part of the policy brief, would you understand what changes are being promoted? These recommendations might be the only part of the policy brief that someone reads. To increase the chances that someone's going to want to read your brief, make sure that the title is both engaging and informative. The title should tell the reader what the brief is about and why he or she should read it. So, as we mentioned earlier, this title isn't terribly engaging or informative. This one does a better job of piquing the reader's interest. Now we've talked about the main elements of a policy brief. Here's a quick test you can try to get a general idea of how well a policy brief communicates. Pick up a policy brief that you haven't read before and give yourself just 30 to 45 seconds to read it before putting it down. And then see if you can answer these questions. What is the purpose? What is the problem? And what changes are recommended? A really good policy brief will convey at least partial answers to these questions in less than a minute of reading. Fortunately, there are some ways that you can organize your policy brief to make it a more powerful communication tool and make it more likely that your reader can pick out that important information even if they're just skimming it. First of all, start with your conclusions. Tell the reader in the first paragraph where you're taking them. And then help the reader follow your argument by using visual cues. For instance, you can format the brief to break up the text and help the reader digest your argument in chunks. Make sure you have wide enough margins and plenty of white space. You can use headings to break the text into sections and make it easier to navigate. Make important or engaging information stand out with formatting tools. So for instance, you could use a bulleted list for recommendations, you could use call-outs for illuminating quotes, or bold font for a key point that you really want to stand out. The way you write is just as important for getting your point across. To make it easy for your reader to understand and remember your message, you'll need to streamline and energize your language. Writing for clarity and simplicity is a big topic. It could fill an entire course. In this short lecture, we're just going to touch on a few tips for being economical in your word choice, using an active voice, and creating uncluttered sentences. Here are some questions to ask yourself when you edit your policy brief. Did you utilize a big word like utilize when you could have used a smaller one like use? Can you cut words or phrases without changing the meaning? And have you used a phrase or clause when just a word or two would do? Avoid buzzwords and jargon. Be specific. Just as it's tempting to talk in abstracts when we're not really sure what we're saying, sometimes we use jargon when we're not quite sure of the meaning in the first place. So finding a different way of saying something might tighten up your argument and make it more effective. So as just one example, instead of using the word operationalize, you could try something like carry out or put into practice. You can save space and syllables by using preventive instead of preventative, and instead of additionally, and before instead of prior to. And one last example. You never should need to use the phrase, "it is important to note." If it weren't important to note, you wouldn't include it in your policy brief, so you can just omit that phrase altogether. Play with these phrases and sentences and see if you can tighten up the language. Go ahead and pause the video if you'd like to take a moment to rephrase them. Another way to make your text more engaging is to use the active voice. People do things is more engaging than things were done. Now, sometimes the passive voice is necessary in scientific writing, but try to use it only when you really have to. Another tip is to use a verb rather than its noun form. So, for example, this study focuses on instead of the focus of this study is on. And finally, the way you structure sentences has a lot to do with how engaging and accessible your writing is. If you've strung out information into multiple sentences, see if you can consolidate them into a single sentence. Conversely, if you've packed a lot of information into a long sentence, you might want to break it up into shorter, clearer ones. And if the subject and verb aren't easy to quickly identify, that's a clue that you might be packing too much into the sentence. Most, if not all, public health policy briefs will involve data. Whether you're using data to provide evidence for a problem or to demonstrate the effects of changes in policies or programs, those data are an integral part of your argument. The data should speak to the reader as clearly and concisely as your text. So choose your data carefully. Provide enough information, but not too much. Try not to overwhelm the reader with statistics. Choose the most important and compelling data for your aim and your audience. The data should be easy to understand without training in statistics, and it needs to be connected to your text without being duplicative. So if you're incorporating data into the text itself, don't duplicate the same information in a graph. Studies show that 59.63% of readers will fall asleep before reading the end of this sentence. 12.42% of readers will remember only the topic of the study. 17.03% will recall one number but not what it referred to, and 10.92% will be doing a crossword puzzle. That was a good example of very bad presentation of data. Here's a better way to convey the same information. Notice that I've rounded up to whole numbers because for our purposes, the 2 decimal places aren't important. I've used a graph because 4 categories were too many to effectively present in a sentence. And I've ordered the categories. Depending on what you're showing, you could order from largest to smallest or vice versa. I've omitted the grid lines and the x-axis because I didn't need them to tell the story I wanted to tell. This graph makes the main point that by the end of that sentence I showed on the last slide, 60% of readers had fallen asleep. When you're thinking about how to present data, start by asking what story you want to tell. Use graphs to show relationships and when the shape of the data is important. So if you're presenting a pattern, a trend, or a comparison of some sort, a graph may be most effective. Use a table only if the reader needs to be able to look up individual values or if you really need to show precise values. Tables usually are not the most effective way to present information in a policy brief because the message doesn't jump out. The reader has to work a little harder to extract it. Now, pie graphs are very common, but some communications experts point out that bar graphs are nearly always better choices. That's because it's easier to compare relative sizes or proportions in a bar graph. And again, we want to make it as easy as possible for the reader to quickly get the message. Toward that end, there are ways we can design graphs to make them easier to understand. First and foremost, if it doesn't contribute information, leave it out. Less ink, more data. Omit or lighten grid lines. Put the information where it's needed, such as by using data labels instead of a legend when possible. Don't duplicate information. You probably don't need a legend and labels, for instance, and in some cases you can omit axis markings or even the axis itself if you have labels where they're needed. Don't use 3D effects unless you're actually telling a story that has to be told in 3 dimensions, in which case you are probably going to confuse most readers anyway. And don't make the reader turn sideways. All of the text in the graph should be horizontal. And finally, use colors that will copy well in black and white because your brief might be printed in grayscale or photocopied. I've presented here just a short introduction to writing effective policy briefs. There's a lot more to be learned, but in truth, the best way to learn is by practicing. I'll leave you with a nice guiding principle for effective communication. In anything at all, perfection is finally attained not when there is no longer anything to add, but when there is no longer anything to take away.